Let's begin. Study session of May 1st, 2017, and we always start with citizen comment on agenda items, and we do have two cinnamons. Charlie Meyers, item 2.
Should I go to the podium?
Yeah, go ahead.
Say your name and spell your last name, and please speak very close to the microphone.
All right, I will. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak. My name is Charlie Meyers. I live at 3620 Otis Street in Wheat Ridge, District 1. And I'm here to give support and offer assistance on the bicycle pedestrian master plan. I'm on the board of Bike Jeffco, the bicycle advocacy organization for Jefferson County. And we certainly applaud this development of now having a final draft, or near final, very close to final, draft of the Bike Ped Master Plan, as it really will move Wheat Ridge toward being a first-class city for bicycling and walking. It will also make Wheat Ridge a safer place to bike and walk as well. Safety is a paramount concern of ours, and a master plan that will guide the implementation of infrastructure projects can have a significant impact on reducing crashes. Thanks to Wheat Ridge Police Department, ATAD was able to review the crash data for a 3-year period, and with that baseline data, we have been able to look to see what we should expect in terms of crashes, and this bike master plan should reduce the crashes, and we can now look back after a number of years after the implementation of the plan and see where we stand regarding that. So Bike Jeffco, in collaboration with ATAD, would like to offer our support and help to Wheat Ridge Public Works in furthering the master plan. Just one last comment. We've looked through the master plan, and we were so impressed with, we thought it was 52 proposed bicycle facility projects. We scrolled on down and we realized it's 96. So it's very comprehensive, and we also applaud Tool Design, their work on the project. So perhaps it's in the area of prioritization that we might be able to help, and ATAT could be part of that as well, but we'll be talking to Scott on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. Jess Hastings, followed by Jeff Sokol, or Sokol, maybe.
I'm Jess Hastings, Hastings, and this is Jeff Sokol, Sokkel. We're with Alfred Benish and Company. We were hired by the city to help them with the ADA transition plan. Should we run through the presentation now, Scott, or come a little bit later?
No,
Okay.
I didn't realize. I thought you were perhaps public.
Oh, we just signed in for that. We're looking forward to our presentation, though.
Yeah, boy, you are. They're here, folks, in case you didn't know that. Okay, I don't think we have any other public comment. We can move right on to staff reports, starting with the sign code update.
Am I introducing you, or are you introducing?
They're fighting over it.
You're first
Okay.
on the memo.
I'm first
so
on the
you'll
memo.
start, I'll go second.
Council, you have a memo from me and from Ken on sign code regulation. This is triggered in part by the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in June of 2015 in the Reed versus Gilbert case. And if I tried to boil that case down to a paragraph, so that's not bad for boiling down a United States Supreme Court decision, but it was a unanimous decision written by Justice Thomas, who in the entire time he's been on the court has asked something like 3 questions ever. But he got the opinion, and it was, as I say, unanimous, although there are a bunch of concurring opinions, and I won't bore you with all the details of that. But it's interesting. In any event, this has created a need for cities across the country and counties, whoever regulates signs, to address their sign code regulations. As I pointed out in the memo, The fact pattern read was where it was a temporary church. Each week they met at a different place and they would put up signs in Gilbert, Arizona, which is a suburb of Phoenix. And they'd put up signs saying, this week services for the XYZ church are at the community center or wherever. Gilbert, Arizona had a sign code that regulated temporary event signs differently than other kinds of signs. But, of course, you have to read the sign to determine whether or not it's advertising a temporary event or it's advertising Pennzoil or auto repair somewhere. So you actually had to read the sign to determine how it was regulated. And the church challenged that and said, that's a regulation of free speech. You're telling me what I can or can't say based upon having read it. The Supreme Court agreed and basically threw out their sign code, and along with it, sign codes pretty much across the country, because most sign codes up until then had things like advertising sign, real estate sign, you name any others that you want, auto repair sign. You've got to read the sign to determine how it's regulated, and then you decide what permit and how big it can be and where it can be and how large and if it can be lighted or not. That's been a key feature of sign code regulation for decades. Many of the concurring justices said, you've done a lot more here than you've affected a lot more than you needed to get to this decision. But nevertheless, you read the concurring or the majority opinion, that's what we have to follow. So the rule then is, if you have to read the content of the sign, if you have to read it to decide whether it gets lit or how big it is or where it can be, then it's a regulation of free speech. Now, government can regulate free speech, but only if it is in aid of what they call a compelling governmental interest. You can't shout fire in a crowded theater. You're speaking, that's First Amendment speech, but it would cause panic, and that's a pretty high bar to jump over. And I've told you in the memo, no sign code is going to jump over that bar, because the kind of public safety issues that we have are visual clutter, not nearly as high as fire in a crowded theater. And you also have to be able to say that there's some other less restrictive means of doing what you want to do, in addition to it being compelling governmental interest. Very difficult to do. Nobody has taken that position. Everyone is rewriting their sign codes. So that's sort of the bad decision, or the bad news. The good news is a couple of things. Things like no moving parts, no lighting, no signs that rotate or make noise, no signs in the public right-of-way are perfectly fine, because think about it. You don't have to read the sign to know it's moving. You don't have to read the sign to know it's in the road. You don't have to read the sign to know it's obscuring a stop sign. These are all things that are time, place, and manner, not content related. Since the decision came down, I've rewritten several sign codes for cities, and really the solution isn't so bad. You shift from content related to size, shape, and nature of the sign. So monument sign, wall sign, pennant sign, banner sign, wave sign, projecting sign, roof sign. These are all sign types. And you can say within a given zone district that here are the only sign types you can have, and here's the sizes in that zone district. Again, you don't have to read the sign to know that. So it sounds in some ways harder than it is, but it has forced cities to look at sign regulation in a sort of fundamentally different way than they used to, because we used to just categorize things by who it was they were advertising, and you had to read it to know that. Now we can't do that, but there's a pretty good plan B. It's been done a number of times. I've done it. So now is a good time, and the city needs to get in that place. And there are some other changes too that community development would like to make while we're at it. You don't want to address the sign code more often than you have to. Questions about Reed versus Gilbert and sort of what it does and says and doesn't say? For Supreme Court watchers, it's fun to read the opinions and see Justice Kagan poking at Justice Alito and him poking back, but that's a real inside baseball kind of activity. But if you're really dying for the opinion, I will send it to you, and you can see them take some shots at each other. It's fun. Thank you. I think Ken's going to talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. So by and large, as Jerry notes, I mean, we're really undergoing this sign code amendment, or proposing to comply with this Supreme Court decision. And we, like with all components of our zoning code and regulations in general, we kind of always want to keep an eye on them and see if there's aspects of them that need to be changing. We in large part, measure that take that temperature or the barometer based on feedback we receive. We're getting a lot of complaints about the applicability of this section, or, why can't I have X sign in this location? And we really, I think, don't get a lot of those complaints. So we haven't anticipated some sort of a more major overhaul of the sign code to address concerns that we think need addressing. So we'd really like to focus the amendment or the rewriting of it on the Reed versus Gilbert aspects. That said, we do anticipate that for a couple of reasons it might be a repeal and reenact, so it would be a whole new ordinance that you're looking at. We think there are opportunities to make it a little more user-friendly. It's got a pretty cumbersome series of tables in there that you have to navigate through. Don't know exactly what that looks like, but I think there's probably an opportunity to physically make it more user-friendly, and we certainly intend to do that without significantly changing the content, other than in terms of, are you allowed a monument sign? Are you allowed a wall sign? How many square footages? We don't anticipate amending those sorts of substantive regulations. A sign code amendment, if you do it in a more thorough, comprehensive manner, can be a pretty significant effort, both labor intensive and also, importantly, involving the public. I mean, our sign code regulates thousands of individual businesses in this community, and you don't amend those regulations without talking with those folks. And that's all well and good. We can do that, but it is a pretty significant effort, and again, can be fairly labor intensive. So we're not proposing that sort of amendment because we really don't think we're going to be messing around with kind of their rights as businesses to have reasonable signage in a variety of different forms and fashions on their properties and in front of their businesses. That said, we have three minor topics for you to consider, probably with varying degrees of importance to us. Illumination of LED signs, I think, is something that I know I've had individual conversations with several of you on this topic. LED signs have become much more common. Historically, the city has not had any regulations about how they're illuminated and how that illumination, how bright those signs are at different times of day. We've been fortunate that when the issue has come up, in several instances, we've had cooperative sign contractors and business owners who have been able to adjust the illumination of signs when they were perceived to be overly bright. And how that usually comes up is that it's not, I guess, rocket science. If a sign has a certain level of illumination that works during the day, and you have that same level of illumination of it at night, it's going to look a lot brighter, right? Because it's against a dark sky as opposed to fighting with the sun for illumination. So the technology is fairly straightforward, that you can make those LED signs variable to adjust to the level of ambient light. And we think some sort of a regulation in that regard would be appropriate, so that we can have a little more proactive ability to tell a sign contractor when we issue a permit that they need to incorporate that technology. And we need to dive a little deeper in exactly what that looks like. But that's one area that we would suggest to council that we'd like to take a look at and add to our regulations. A second topic that has come up, maybe with a little bit less frequency, but certainly with some eagerness, is from some business districts that want signs to direct the traveling public to their district if they're kind of off the beaten path. One example is the 29th Avenue Business District. They've been interested for, frankly, a couple years now. They've been patient waiting for this kind of sign amendment to move forward, so I thank them for that. But they'd like some sort of small identification on Sheridan or Wadsworth. And if you try, the only example I can think of is on, you see these signs in Denver on some of their thoroughfares directing to like the Old South Gaylord District off of University. They're small signs. So setting Reed versus Gilbert aside, because I know Jerry still is kind of navigating how we can do that and still be content neutral. We're encouraging him to be creative because we think it's an important kind of public sign, if you will, because it's a business district, not just one business. So we're working our way through that. But if council's supportive, we'd like to continue to try at least to create an ability for those types of business districts to have some sort of kind of identification on some of our major thoroughfares, since we do have a lot of traffic on some of our major thoroughfares, and we'd love those districts to be able to take advantage of that in a little more proactive way. And then finally, and probably a little bit of a lesser concern for us, but just something that's been a little bit new, and it's not really new, but new since we last amended our code, but some temporary signs that I think some businesses like. We get some complaints, I think, from some people, whether they find them appropriate. And those are twofold. There's maybe more, and we could look into that more if council directs us to do so. But temporary sign spinners, so where you actually have a physical person that's advertising either on private property or more often in the public right-of-way. And, there could be some, traffic safety concerns in terms of whether that represents a distraction or whether there's actually, potentially physical conflicts with pedestrians or vehicles because of those types of what we call sign spinners. And then the other ones I don't have a perfect name for. I think the industry calls them different things, but they're temporary sign that was mounted to a pole that would be kind of a pennant, like a flutter sign. And we see these popping up a lot at different businesses. And again, we don't have a lot of answers because our code is silent to them as to whether or not they're allowed. It's a challenging thing for code enforcement to either tell them, sure, you can do those, or no, you can't, or you can only have one, or we just don't have any regulations around those. So those are a couple categories of temporary signs that we thought it might be worth looking into a little more and making some recommendations for council to consider. But that's really our short list, and I think we're here tonight to get your sign off and blessing to move forward at a minimum on the Reed versus Gilbert changes that are important because it's a U.S. Supreme Court decision and it's a First Amendment issue. The other three topics or others that you might want to bring up would be welcome direction as well.
Okay, council has questions. Let's start with Janice.
Okay, so first, yes, I think that we should move forward with the Reed versus Town of Gilbert changes. Some questions I have though, Ken, so one of the things when I was reading the sign code over the weekend, there was one on the LED that said that what was on it the message had to stay for, is it 15 seconds?
That's correct.
And then it's not allowed to have movement otherwise. It should. So now some of these LED signs have moving borders around their message that's staying for 15 seconds. So is that something, is that considered movement? Is that, something that we could look at addressing in that?
I think I don't have the language in front of me, but I think the intent of that is more so on like an animated sign that again can present more of a visual distraction, I think, and a nuisance particularly for the driving public. The reason so we might need to look into that a little more, is the suggestion that the border a movable border seems appropriate, perhaps, or not?
I kind of think
it could be
not.
arguably
it's because it's
distraction as well.
It is a distraction, but it's also kind of a gray line. Like if it's a small movable border, it's
right.
not as when they have like this much moving, then so I would err on the caution of not at all. It would be kind of
okay,
in my opinion. And then I have had several sign conversations with a couple of citizens about specifically blade signs that are not allowed currently. And the only thing I could figure out is because they come off of the building further than what we allow. We allow.
Yeah, I think that's a
but
good
not-
comment. I'd need to look again. I don't have the code in front of me, but I think there's an issue of not allowing blade signs and wall signs. So on a street, do you know if that's right, Zach? Does that ring a bell? Okay, we'll have to look into that. But is the interest in making sure that we allow blade signs?
I think that they on some of our buildings that have nice architectural buildings, that when you're driving down the street and it's just like
Right.
let's say like Joe DeMott's building where
Right, sure.
Posy Girl is, right?
Okay.
It's very hard to see her sign. It's behind a tree. If it was standing off of the building and a
Right.
blade sign, then
Right.
I think it's works with the aesthetics of the community. also.
Right. Well, it just based on direction from all the council, I don't think we need to dive into the details, but we'll take a look at that because I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the blade signs, as council probably gets, but are very appropriate in kind of a Main Street environment, right, where you're not doing like this.
Mm-hmm.
You're maybe walking down the sidewalk, and that blade sign's going to catch your eye, whether you be any mode of travel, right, car. It can be an effective sign, so.
And then the other sign that's often a topic of conversation is iconic signs. So an example would be like if, let's say, my company had an iconic sign, it would be a large hammer or something, and it said Compass Construction on it. Is that something that we can maybe look at doing, like by special use or something to kind of permit? It can create also a piece of art, like it can create a kind of a art looking sign, and so that's the only reason why I would like to maybe look at if we want to consider those.
There's been an objection for some time, but I can't remember what it was.
The cat.
Cat one on 44th, so that's what started it? Okay. Just,
So and those are. Oh, and then I had one other comment on the temporary signs on the spinners. Would that be something that we would maybe regulate how often the business could have a sign spinner, or would it be something where if they wanted to pay, they could have a sign spinner out every day in the public right of way, or have you thought about that?
Hadn't thought about that necessarily. It's certainly possible on temporary signs to regulate their duration. I know some communities, for instance, not Wheat Ridge, but for banners, they'll allow them for only a certain period of time. Wheat Ridge actually allows all businesses to have one banner under certain kind of design parameters, but and certain size parameters, but for all time, right? So you can have them 365 days a year. I think with any time of any sort of a time limitation, it's an enforcement question, I guess. There'd presumably have to be some sort of a permit process for that and tracking, and then we'd have to be monitoring that in the field. Doesn't mean we can't do it. It's just that would be the only comment I'd make.
Thank you.
Mr. Fitzgerald, please.
I was just going to say, I think I've had the same conversation with Joey, and one of the things that they were thinking about was thematic blade signs to try to brand a particular section of a thoroughfare as being a little shopping district of one kind. They were trying to brand that district, so I support blade signs. I think when you're talking about the flapping signs, we should also think about air giants. Right. And also the mannequins that stand along the highway. Right. Yeah, that's right. Right.
To encourage those?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Want them to be more interesting than they are. And I certainly want to support regulating brightness on electronic signs. And I think we need an absolute measurement, certain number of lumens at a certain distance. I'm mostly concerned about nighttime, not daytime. So I just want to support all those things.
Ms. Duran.
Thank you. Back to the LED lights. I'm in support of the brightness. If we could do it like from sunset to sunrise, if we could figure out what a good brightness would be, because it's in a residential area. I don't know if we should discuss limiting how many can be in a residential area, if we need to discuss setbacks in residential areas. As far as the motion, I know some of them do have a motion on them, and they kind of move, and at night that's really annoying to some of the neighbors around there who have to deal with that. So I'd like to kind of look at all of those things when you bring it back to us and discuss really, having a setback, having a sunset to sunrise, having the brightness dimmed at night. And also, do you know if those are solar powered?
They aren't typically. I'm not sure if they can be or not.
Okay, I'd like to kind of talk about that some more
Okay.
too. And that's it. Thank you.
Ms. Wooden.
Thank you. I also would support a review of the LED signs and the brightness. I live near a very big, bright LED sign myself, so I know how much light those things can actually put off. But I didn't see it really talked about in detail here, and I'm wondering if we might also discuss the content of the sign. And I know the owner of the LED sign that I'm thinking of, he had wanted to put on his sign, help the city promote an event like the Carnation Festival, and we had said we couldn't do that because of code. So I'm wondering, are we going to address at all the content of what they can put in their signs?
I'd recommend that we not,
Okay.
because that's not only telling people what, that's regulating the sign on the basis of what it says, and in part telling people, here's what you can say, here's what you can't, here's what you can say if you do this or that.
Well, he had wanted to help the city promote like the Carnation Festival, and we had told him he couldn't, and I just wasn't clear on why he couldn't. He was trying to do something helpful for the community, and he was told he couldn't, so.
There's a couple things. That becomes, under our existing regulatory environment,
Right.
again, we're moving away
Right.
from content evaluation, so I agree with Jerry, that would be challenging, but under our existing regulatory framework, that would be considered an off-premise sign, and therefore essentially a billboard,
Okay.
right? Because and billboards are only, as council probably is aware, we have a cap of 16 billboards, and the whole special framework that we have around billboards in the city. It's been a couple of years, and probably not all of you were on council at the time, but we did bring the topic of LED billboards to city council a couple of years ago, because there's certain of those billboard sign owners are interested in incorporating LED technology in those. One of the reasons that they argue to do that is that does give them the ability to do things like Amber Alerts, things like community events if they have dead time, or just as a community service. Again, this content neutrality issue now makes that challenging perhaps, but council's direction at that time was that you weren't really interested in that, in allowing for that LED technology. So we don't allow LED changeable copy billboards currently. I don't know if you have anything to add, Jerry.
Okay.
No, I think that
I was just
that
curious
covers
if
it.
people wanted, this business owner was wanting to help the community, and I was just curious about that.
Let me remind council, I've not heard much about the additional off-premise signs, as well as too much about the temporary sign or the fluttering signs. Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I guess to the previous discussion we had about the off-premise signs, wouldn't that necessarily be a content-neutral policy in that we're not talking about the content, we're just saying it has to be related to the premise at hand versus it's not really speaking to what the content is, it's just saying it has to be related to the property it's located on.
The trick is, typically communities will prohibit off-premise signs. How do you know it's off-premise? Well, you got to read it to see that it's advertising Compass Construction and it's not on their land. I've thought of a couple ways to get around that, to say that the property on which the sign is located must have, if commercial, a business license, or some way to connect that up. That's frankly more of a problem in counties where you have a lot of off-premise. That's, you've got a sign on some farmer's land 5 miles outside of town. The trick is to avoid having to read the sign to be able to apply whatever regulation you come up with. And that's really difficult. As Ken said, his department has really leaned on me to come up with a creative idea. And I'm thinking about business licenses. There's a little room in the Supreme Court's decision for directional signage. That I don't think is an exception. You can drive a truck through, things like hospital this way, things like that we see that are important. Post office, you often see that, it's a directional sign. House numbering signs are okay, kind of below the level of detection. I continue to struggle a little bit with being able to permit a truly off-premise, substantial advertising opportunity without having to identify it as such. And I've got my marching orders, and I want to make it happen. I'm reaching out to other city attorneys to see what bright ideas other people have come up with for that sort of thing, because it's used frequently. And many cities actually have programs for that, where Aurora had a program for home builders that would say, you know, the Pulte homes this way from the 200s to the 400s. And what they were trying to do is reduce, more than you care about, reduce the number of little signs that kind of are bandit signs poked up in the right of way, and so to kind of embrace it and say to the home building industry, come to us and we'll put you on our big monument sign. What I actually might well do is talk to Aurora and see how if they've still got that program in place now that they have the Reed decision, because it really is that kind of thing. It's a sign directing people to somewhere else. I'm working on it.
So to that end, with respect to some similar models within the Federal Highway Administration, they have a sign program relative to pit stops or opportunities to use the restroom, and the businesses that are located on those signs have to meet certain criteria, that they are providing a public restroom, that they're open a certain amount of time, and there's some other criteria there, but that then allows that sort of, it's not a billboard, but it is an off-premise sign, either pointing to a district or pointing to a set number of businesses that meet that criteria. And it's sort of like that off-ramp next type
It's a
of.
good model, tourist-oriented directional signs, I think they call them TODs.
And so something.
There's a state statute on that point as well.
That it's not so much regulating on content, it's the criteria that you set relative to who can be on that sign, and they have to, you know, have an ADA bathroom or
There will be a sign here. If you want to be on that sign, here are the standards.
something like
And,
that.
you know, you don't have to read the sign to, I mean, what that lets you do is really sort of control the access to the sign, which you can do because you don't have to care what it says if you're controlling access to it. You can probably do that control without knowing what it says.
Right. And then the next question I had was regarding the spinners and the temporary signs. And is there any crossover, or as we write this, how does that deal with sign flyers and individuals who are soliciting for funds on the right of way, and how does this impact their maneuvers, or does that impact the homeless in any way, or how do we address that aspect of it?
A number of the cities I've worked with have chosen to just say they have a category of exempt signs that are not regulated, house identification signs, things like that. Those categories are going to get a lot smaller now with the Reed decision. And a few of them have said signs being carried by people is an exemption, so that you don't have to read the sign to know that, and you just know you're not regulating it. Now that does mean that you have the sign spinners, et cetera. The question is, how much of an impact on your community is that, and where do you want to, as Ken says, spend your enforcement dollars? Mm-hmm. That's a real simple way out. It's harder to regulate it than it is to just say never mind, but that's one way to do it.
I have two more issues. As it relates to the ambient light technology, if a sign does not currently have that, I'd be interested to know what the cost is to retrofit that. That would seem to be in some ways prohibitive for existing signs. But as it relates to being perceived to be overly bright, that would be somewhat subjective, so we need to have some type of clear criteria, similar to what Mr. Fitzgerald indicated with the looms, by distance or some measure of that. And then with respect to political signs in public right-of-way or on city property, how is that handled in this situation? Because I know we've had situations in the past and previous campaigns where campaigns have put their political signs in city parks and city-owned property, and the city is reluctant to remove those. So I'm curious if we can devise some way to handle those.
This will really be the place to make clear what the city wants to have happen on its proprietary lands, the lands the city owns. The problem always is if you've allowed some signage on parks, and there are signs on the back of the infield. It's the classic place, you're making it into a limited public forum. And the minute you do that, you're saying you can't distinguish between viewpoints. And I often tell people that when the KKK wants to put their brochure in the little kiosk in the rec center lobby, and you have allowed the massage therapists and the Audubon Society to put their brochure, you've created a limited public forum, and you can't say no. And that's something that comes as a shock to people, but it's a classic. So the point is that you can control your publicly owned spaces. Very few spaces are actually a public forum that you can't tell people they can't be on. Sidewalks are a classic public forum. Probably the lobby here, and certainly the sidewalk leading to the lobby, classic public forums. But just because it's a park does not make it a public forum for the establishment of signs like that. And I think as a part of this code, it'll be time for the city to make really some pretty clear distinctions around that, because political signs are classic free speech. So you need to know whether you're going to exercise your proprietary authority to say no signs on public property except. And then you have some pretty narrow exceptions, typically for the limited public forum kinds of things. You can certainly say no permanent signs even there. You don't want someone erecting a vote for Jerry Dahl sign, even though it's a, you'd never see that. But if you were, it's better for me to use me as an example, on the sidewalk out here, certain people can come and I can hold my sign up, and a classic, but I'm glad you asked it, because now is really the time to create those rules and enforce them. And I'm kind of warning you that there will be people that will feel injured by that have had access, that won't be able to have access, because you've got to have one rule that fits everybody, not just the people you like or the viewpoints you like, or that are deemed morally acceptable.
So is there any sort of threshold to say that those that have been placed with permission versus not, that there's some distinction there where an individual goes and stakes a sign into city property, claiming a particular political viewpoint, but it hasn't been approved by any city staff? How is that permissible?
It's not. If you're saying no signs on our property except, and this is in an area where that's not one of the exceptions, doesn't matter what it says, doesn't matter what their motivation for it was. You need to avoid someone in the city saying it's okay, but assuming that we get the rules out there and everyone in the city understands them, then you pull them up. Just like if somebody puts a sign in my front yard that I've not consented to, then it's out of there if I want it out of there.
And those exceptions can be, you said, narrowly defined, but
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. I'm glad you raised the question. It's one I want to address here, and it's one that will not make everyone universally happy. But I think it's time to, because otherwise what we have is kind of a case-by-case set of fact patterns that comes up, and those questions come into me, and I end up having to evaluate it based upon kind of how the city has treated that property in the past. And truthfully, how the city has treated that property in the past was not with putting up a bunch of political signs in mind. They've treated it in the past with this other purpose in mind, thinking that they could limit it to that. But truthfully, once, the horse is out of the barn on that, it's really out of the barn. So now's the time to make the rules more universally clear.
Ms. Davis?
So I'm going to make mine quick. So I support everything that basically people have said about the LEDs. I do support the business district identification signs, and I know exactly what you're talking about in the Old South Gaylord, and I think it's helpful, especially knowing where I'm going. I sometimes need that sign to know where to turn left. And it would even be, I'm even thinking in Edgewater. You never know exactly what street to go to Sloan's to turn down in Edgewater. So I think that would be helpful for 29th Avenue too. So I guess I'm more familiar with that one, so I know where to go. So I would support that. And you're right, it's just kind of like the size of a hospital sign, even blue, and says turn left for, 29th Avenue Business District. So I would support something like that. Temporary signs, I have a question about temporary signs, and it kind of falls into the LED signs. In fact, I just saw it this weekend in my neighborhood or a block away from my neighborhood, that now they have those big old trucks with the signs that flash and move. And so it's kind of a temporary sign slash LED sign, and they move. And they're, as far as the content, and they're loud. And so I'm wondering if there's a way we could address those types of things in that, or if it would fall under LED. But I think you see those.
Are they the ones that they're moving, though? They're driving, right?
No, they park. They park, and it's a big old sign. In fact, there was one on Wadsworth this weekend. It's a big old sign, and it'll flash, and so I think, you don't see them a lot, but you see them enough that we should probably acknowledge them. And then the other thing with the temporary signs, I do support something to the effect of how long it's there, because sometimes they look ratty, like those ones that are kind of curved. They kind of look like a leaf. They look all ratty, and that's not good either. So I would support something in the code there. And then the other thing is I do think if we set up something to not put on city property, which again I completely support, but I do think we need to be very specific on what or whom or for what, because I don't want to put the staff in a situation where one staff said yes, and then the next person that goes there says no. So I want it to be very objective. I don't want to insult the Girl Scouts because we put something up for the Boy Scouts, So I think we need to be pretty specific in those signs if we do that, just to protect everybody's feelings and also the staff as far as in their decision-making process. And that's my 2 cents.
Mr. Pond?
I'm tracking with everyone, I think. The Reed update is fine. I have nothing really to add to the LED signs that hasn't already been said. I do support the off-premises district sign, and I think some of the ideas that have come up are should be pursued. And I think Ms. Davis just said it. And to me, temporary means that we ought to be willing to limit duration, and if we don't limit duration currently in our code, I think we should be considering that. So if it's a 365 deal and they can put something up, then I'm not sure that's temporary. That doesn't sound temporary. So, if that's the case, I'd like to look at that.
Ms. Hoppy again? I think he's done.
So on this subject of temporary signs, do we regulate how many temporary signs a property can have?
Yes and no. For banners, we just have that, you can have one. It has to be mounted to the wall. You can have it, there's some size limitations, and you can have it 365 days a year. There's some other limitations on other kind of things like pennants, and I'm not sure if some of those have time limits, to be honest. But let me answer your question in a little different way, which is our next steps would be to take this preliminary direction from council that we're getting this evening, have a second, more substantive study session that drills into some of these things in a little more detail and gives you some options. So I'm hearing some different things on temporary signs, but definitely some interest in taking a look at those. So we can package that for council's kind of consideration of, this is the existing framework, based on our research, these are some different models that we could take a look at for time limitations or other limitations on the type and quantity of temporary signs. So I think to better answer your question would be to get more information in front of you and get some options on the table.
Yeah, I ask because there's 2 situations that I think of. One of them is the gas stations, when they have 6 or 7 temporary signs about advertising different cigarette brands and how much, and or maybe there'll be a Pepsi. It'll be 5 for cigarettes and 1 for Pepsi or something like that. And it seems as though they very often have that many signs up. And while it may change from brand to brand, they still end up with like 6 signs, and it's visual litter. And then the second thing that I have in mind is that I know that bars and restaurants, when they do, let's say, events like they're going to give away Broncos tickets, or I used to work at a place where we had a bikini contest, and our signs that we put up that were temporary signs were only allowed to be, like, if it was a 5-week event and it had the dates on it, it was only allowed to be up for like those dates, even though it also advertised like beer specials that were happening for the rest of the summer or something like that. So those are the kinds of things I'm thinking that we may want to look at in our temporary signage, like to try to address.
Fair enough, and I think, you know, you get into some issues with content neutrality on some of those things as well that we'll need to be cognizant of as we look at different options. In terms of your kind of overall comment, I mean, I think it'd be my observation that sign compliance, temporary sign compliance, has not been a code enforcement priority for the city historically. I think when we talk again on this topic, we'll probably be looking for more input from you on that. We've certainly heard at your recent strategic planning session that code enforcement is a priority for you all, I think, as a body. And in my opinion, at least, and I'd be curious for your much more important input than mine, you know, that could be an area in terms of code enforcement that we could spend some more resources on, because the quick answer on that gas station example is that probably, you know, 3 or 4 of those signs just aren't legal, right? But we haven't necessarily been making that a top priority from code enforcement. You know, window sign limitations is another area where we've been working with some businesses on just this topic, so it's kind of front of and center in my mind, but is another area where we don't do real active code enforcement. You know, we have a limitation of 25% of your window area for a commercial tenant space can be used for window signage, and certainly there's plenty of businesses out there that exceed that. So, you know, if council perceives that to be visual clutter or an issue, you know, we'd like to hear that and know whether that should be a priority for our code enforcement.
Ken, if I may ask, you referred to signs carried by people. Were you referring there then to both the homeless who are carrying signs as well as people who are flipping and, you know?
I was, yeah.
You were, I'm sorry, I didn't realize it.
Because it's a sign carried by a person, you don't need to really, if that's how you choose to regulate it and exempt it, or control it, I suppose, for that matter, you don't distinguish between, you know, who's carrying it necessarily and what it says.
Okay.
In fact, you shouldn't.
I don't believe there was any response from council on that as to whether that needs to be looked at or not. Did we? Okay. All right. I have Mr. Urban here.
Thank you.
And then we need to kind of.
With respect to the city-owned properties and signage around city-owned properties, can we look at including some type of special events signage process where if an entity has a special event on the property, then they're permitted to sign the property as needed for that event. Thereby, you're not necessarily controlling the content, but you're saying because this is an activity being held on this property, therefore their ability to sign it as needed for that temporary period of time is permitted, or something along those lines.
That wouldn't get us into the read.
No, that's exactly what we've talked about.
Because that's proprietary. You know, you're really wearing your property owner hat more than you are your regulatory hat for that. Making certain that you don't turn it into a public forum, but typically not. You have special event permitting signs for the infield, whatever. That's likely not going to turn it into a public forum for First Amendment purposes, and you can keep your restrictions pretty tight.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Mayor, can I make a consensus?
Pardon?
Can I make a consensus then, so we can move?
Yeah, if you'd care to. I don't know if this needs to, but.
All right, so I'd like to make a consensus that we direct staff and city attorney to move forward with the Reed versus Town of Gilbert changes, while also incorporating the discussed items as far as LED signs, off-premise business district identification, temporary signs, and the additional requests of blade signs and the possibility of icon signs. Is that it? Is that it?
Show of hands.
Do I have a consent?
Okay, we can move on to item 1B, Jeffco Bicycle Wayfinding Project. Scott Brink.
I have a little PowerPoint here. I'm just wondering if it's possible to dim these lights here a little bit. There we go.
Mr. Brink, is this PowerPoint going to be in the City Drive under council presentations? Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. We're going to talk about some more signs in a different little context, hopefully not quite as complicated, but we'll be talking about the Jeffco Regional Wayfinding signage project, which we'll be going pretty soon here. We're looking at it possibly as early as June here. We'll start seeing some signs going up on regional bike routes. And then following this, we'll be talking about the bike ped master plan a little bit, which kind of interrelates with this a little bit, and also the ADA transition plan. So this all kind of interrelates together really good. This process started about a year and a half ago. It was spearheaded by by Jefferson County and the city of Lakewood, with participation from all the other Jefferson County municipalities, advocacy groups, parks and so forth. But I know you can't quite see this, but this is just a page from the executive summary from the final report, which kind of goes over the whole purpose of why we did this, the vision, the process went through. Kind of in a short sense, the purpose of this whole thing was to really establish a clear visual language and graphic standards countywide to guide residents and visitors along regional bikeways and destinations. And the way the group got started here, we first did a lot of mapping, data compilation, and so forth. And then we went through a system development, which was basically trying to figure out what are the routes we're talking about, what should be the priority 1s, 2s, 3s for signing, and then also coming up with a standardized sign that we could use countywide that would be easy to manufacture. It would be fairly simple, easy to recognize, but there would also be some flexibility with it to, say, put individual city names on there so that, when people are biking along, they know, where they are. Again, this is just a real big list of all the participants that took part. Again, it was spearheaded by the county and city of Lakewood, these 3 individuals up here. And then the rest of these names are all people from individual cities, the county, CDOT, Dr. Cog, different advocacy groups, ADAT, Denver, Westminster, all those cities have their own respective advocacy groups too, so they were all involved. And then this was all led and guided by the consultant, the Alta Planning Group. This map here kind of gives you a little bit idea. It's the entire county here, and over here, these different colors, which I know are hard to see, but we could go by priority 1, 2, and 3. And to really get this project going, the group really focused on what they considered were like main bicycle corridors that really went the whole length of the county. And that would be the priority 1s that you see in red here. So what you see in red here is 32nd Avenue, which is already signed and striped as a bike route with bike lanes. So we would just be supplementing it with these regional bikeway signs. The other major east-west route is along the W line here, most of it through Lakewood, along an existing off-road path, and then there's some on-street parts of that too. And then a real big one was there really isn't a good north-south bicycle route that goes the whole county. So the group came up with this. It's kind of a combination of Kipling, Garrison, some other streets starting all the way down on the south end by E470, going up along Kipling. It weaves over to Garrison, a few other streets through Crown Hill, and through Wheat Ridge. It'll after it goes through Crown Hill Park, it'll actually go by the high school there on Holland Street, where it's already signed as a bike route to get folks down to Clear Creek. It'll follow Clear Creek just a little bit over to Garrison and then up north through Arvada, and then eventually it ends all the way up here in Westminster, Highway 36. So major north-south bike route. And the thing I want to emphasize here is this is strictly a wayfinding plan. It was really to sign routes that are already there. This wasn't intended to be like a planning document like our bike ped master plan. We weren't out saying, gee, there should be a bike path here, or we should be building bike lanes here. That really isn't what it was all about. Those are all different types of planning documents, really. This was strictly a wayfinding effort. Here's the logo the group came up with. We actually had a lot of different examples to vote on. This large group we had, advisory group, we actually voted on a lot of different options, and this is what it got narrowed down to. Just as you can see, the shape of the county there with a bicycle. And so this will be our standard logo you'll see, but then again, we have names of individual cities depending on where the sign is. So this is a sign that can easily be manufactured by most of the sign shops, and pretty economically as well too, since there isn't a ton of detail on these. Again, here's some other examples of the signs. Wayfinding, as you can see, here's the standard sign, and then we'll have underneath that various destinations. These will be regional destinations, like say, for example, it'll give distances to other cities, like if you're in Wheat Ridge and you're on 32nd Avenue, it'll tell you how far you got to get to Golden or to Denver, and then as you're going along, it'll have signs directing you down to the rec center or the Clear Creek Trail. The more major places that folks are looking for, W-line stations and so forth. These are merely guide signs, just to let folks know that they're on the regional trail, and then we have the turn signs too, where we need those. I'm just going to walk through real quick 32nd Avenue. It starts over here in Golden at Ford Street, right on the west side of the big brewery there. 32nd, it'll go through Jefferson County here, through the Applewood neighborhood, cross into Wheat Ridge at Applewood Center. Just follow right along past Kipling, Wadsworth, Pierce, and then we're going to drop down. The map here shows it dropping down to 29th. Reason it drops down is we wanted to make sure we hooked in with bicycle facilities or bike routes in Denver, and also kind of to pull Edgewater in with it too. So, but we are looking at this stretch a little further. We may consider dropping it down to 26th because we did just restripe those bike lanes there, and it's really nice for that. And it gets more of Edgewater too, and it also connects with 26th Avenue in Denver, which is also a bike route. So, so we're still looking at where really we want to sign this. Again, here's just some examples of the signage going through. If I'm pointing on the west end here, this is closer to Youngfield. This is 32nd Avenue, kind of Lena Gulch running through here. But you can see the various signs here. When we get to some of these locations where there's Parfit and some of these more collector streets, it'll direct folks to various regional destinations such as Clear Creek Trail, the West Line, Lakewood, and so forth. If I keep going, same thing. This is 32nd coming by the high school. Crown Hill curving around toward Wadsworth. Again, we have some signs directing people to different destinations. I know on paper this looks kind of cluttered. It looks like a lot of signs, but when you spread this out over 1.5 miles, it won't look quite so cluttered. And again, the rest of the way, 32nd down to Pierce, 29th past our Ashland Reservoir, and on to Sheridan. And then the central route through Wheat Ridge, again, if north is to the right here, if you're coming from the south across Crown Hill Park, it'll be signed through the park here on the concrete trails there. Go on 32nd here just briefly, and then follow the existing bike route down Holland, Independence, kind of back behind Everett School, and then we hit the Clear Creek Trail down here and follow it over and get to Garrison. And Garrison will be signing that as a bike route. It's already got some nice shoulders striped on it, and kind of serves as a good bicycle facility right now as it is. So we'll be sprucing that up some more with some additional signage and striping. And again, I think this is getting further when we get out of Wheat Ridge. You got I-70 here, going north Garrison, and into Arvada here. I think that's 52nd, and then over to Carr Street and on north up to Westminster and points beyond. So again, the schedule is to get these signs going as early as next month. You know, these three main routes are the priority right now. I think eventually we'll see how this goes. We know once we get the signs up, there'll be some tweaking needed. And whether we go beyond that into the priority 2s or 3s kind of remains to be seen, but it's a start. So any questions? Be happy to try.
Council, want to ask Director Brink any questions? Looks like a great plan, doesn't it? Good job. Thank you. Very good. Mr. Fitzgerald.
Just one quick question. I see one of the priorities is the W line. What about the G line? How does that fit into this?
Let me pull that map back up. Yeah, the G line, let's see if I can find that on the map here. Ward Road doesn't show up very well here, but I think the intent eventually would be to, we're over here, connect it with, it does show up in these orange priority 2 routes. I think, you know, one of the things that that we've talked about quite a bit with, and this gets into the bike ped master plan too, is connecting our main destinations in Wheat Ridge, including the Gold Line station, the G Line station. One of the things we want to do eventually is get a bike route from, or a bike facility from Clear Creek Trail up to the Gold Line. I think that's one of the things spelled out in our plan. Ridge Road, you know, you get further north up here in Arvada, you know, there's the Van Bibber Trail up there, getting connected to that. So, the Gold Line doesn't show up on these existing priority 1 routes right now, but we do want to get there with it and get those added on to this from these 3 spines we're starting with. Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you again.
Yeah.
We can move on to item 2. Same guy.
Okay. I want to introduce Joe Fish here from the Tool Design Group, our consultant that helped us put together this bike ped master plan. It was a great process we went through, and we're charging down the finish line now and getting it wrapped up. And Joe's just going to kind of walk us through give a short little PowerPoint here of the process, how we got to where we are, and then where we go from here, and we'll open it up for questions. So, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Here, let me give you your notes. So I do have a presentation. I'd like to load that up. Is there? Will that work? Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Scott. My name is Joe Fish. I'm with Tool Design Group, and we're a transportation consulting firm based in Washington, D.C., but with an office in Denver. We specialize in pedestrian and bike transportation planning and engineering. So really appreciate this opportunity to talk about the bike and pedestrian master plan with you. As Scott mentioned, we are kind of
nearing completion of the plan. There is a draft version that I believe you've all had access to at this point. So we'll talk about the overall process, and this schedule diagram kind of summarizes it. So we started with data collection, obtained various data sets from the city, and mapped out existing facilities as well as like destinations where people are interested in going. We conducted quite a bit of public outreach, and we also had an open house there kind of in the fall. And then later in the fall, started getting into recommendations and developing the plan. And then finally, here we are in late spring or early summer, moving towards the final plan. So in terms of public engagement, there were several key activities. The first one was a vision and goals workshop, and this really kind of kicked off the project. We had representatives from the city as well as various other public agencies like RTD, Jefferson County. We had representatives from the school district, I think some other kind of community advocates, and basically developed a vision for the plan and goals for the plan. After that, we had an online map-based survey. I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. We attended Ridge Fest. The picture in the lower right there was us getting feedback from the community. We had some maps there and asked people what are some of their concerns, where do they like to bike or walk, where is it difficult to walk or bike. And then later in the project, we had an open house, kind of similar format where people were able to tell us what their priorities were and what some of their challenges were. And then also we had a technical advisory committee throughout the project to give us high-level guidance and basically make sure the plan was headed in a good direction. So this is the map, the online map survey that we did. There were about 100 people that filled out the survey, and they told us of either problem spots or areas that they felt were unsafe, either for crossing or riding a bike, or other areas that they like or that they think are working well. So we developed a plan vision statement based on the Vision and Goals workshop, and it's written here. I won't read it verbatim, but some of the key ideas really were about developing a more comfortable and safe network, and one that accommodates bicyclists and pedestrians of all ages and all abilities, and that's really connected and intuitive and easy to use, and that really connects local destinations, but also fits into the region. So for people that want to get from Wheat Ridge to Denver or Wheat Ridge to Golden, that it facilitates those connections. There's a lot of data in the plan. I just want to highlight a couple important trends. So this first one is in walking commute rates. And the gray bar is from 2000 and then from 2015. So walking has increased as a commuting mode. This is the data from the U.S. Census. Not necessarily a huge increase, but it does show you that Wheat Ridge, relative to some peer cities in the region, is in the upper half, behind Golden and Denver, but has also shown an increase over the last 15 years. But probably more impressively and maybe more interesting, the rate of biking as a commute mode has really increased pretty dramatically over that 15-year period. So almost a factor of 5, from 0.3% to 1.4. So even though these are still pretty small numbers in the big scheme of things, that increase is pretty impressive. And it's put Wheat Ridge really in the same conversation as Golden in terms of bike commuting, and higher than Lakewood and Arvada. So kind of an interesting trend there and something to keep an eye on going forward. As I mentioned, we did conduct a map survey or online survey. And one of the questions we asked was, why is it difficult to walk? And this was spot specific, but to summarize, the responses came down to essentially lack of sidewalks or gaps in the sidewalk network, as well as concerns about traffic. And then similar set of concerns for bicyclists, but a little bit more slanted towards traffic, being too fast and too much traffic, as well as lack of facilities, lack of bike lanes in this case. So taking all of this public input and working with the Technical Advisory Committee, we identified some really key themes for the plan and for the recommendations. And for pedestrians, these were access to bus stops and transit more broadly. Really focusing on key destinations. We know that people walk throughout the city, but in terms of focusing our recommendations and resources, that access to things like shopping centers and schools is really the highest priority. Integrating the recommendations with the ADA transition plan, which I think will be discussed in more detail after this. And serving the needs of both ends of the population. So we know that Wheat Ridge has a high percentage of older folks as well as younger families that are wanting to live here. So, meeting that range of needs. And then in terms of the bike network, again, access to the Gold Line stations is a high priority, as well as access to Clear Creek Trail. That really serves as kind of a spine for the bike network. Crossing I-70 is certainly, there are limited opportunities, so taking advantage of those opportunities where they do exist is a priority. And then connecting to neighboring jurisdictions, so Denver, Arvada, Lakewood, and Golden. So this map is just showing the pedestrian network recommendations, and this is pretty high level citywide, but we did look at the network in detail and identify basically where we think the highest priority gaps are in the network. You can see they're mainly focused on your higher volume streets. We know that there are sidewalk gaps in the neighborhood certainly, but as far as prioritizing, these are the types of streets that are potentially less safe, and that there are more people needing to get from point A to point B on. And then for the bicycle network, a little more variation in terms of the types of facilities. So there's bike lanes, trails, potentially some neighborhood streets that could be either signed or could have other ways of encouraging biking. But the point of this network really is that it creates, well, in fact, a network so that getting from point A to point B, that there are good continuous routes, so that when you're biking, the bike lane doesn't just stop at a busy street. It actually continues in some form or another to get you where you need to go. And then we also have a list of what we're calling higher priority projects. We had a scoring method that looked at proximity to destinations like schools, commercial areas, traffic, levels of traffic, and various other factors to kind of identify which of all the projects that we identified are the highest priority. And it doesn't necessarily mean that these have to be constructed first, but in terms of just general priorities, these are the ones that kind of rose to the top. And these are not actually in order. These are just, I think, the top 20 of the list. So that's all spelled out in the plan, but I'd be happy to take any questions anyone has at this time.
Ms. Duran.
Thank you so much for this presentation, by the way. My question on 29th on proposed sidewalks projects, it says from J Street to Ingalls. I would think it would need to be from Fenton to probably Upham. Can you tell me why and how you came up with J to Ingalls?
Well, I think that's something we'd have to go back and look at. how it's scored in the system. I mean, there's I don't know the total number, but there's over 100 potential projects, and they were all scored individually.
Sure.
So it's tough to kind of see how the score broke down to identify.
Yeah, I understand that, but how did you decide, or who decided just J to Ingalls on 29th instead of taking it from Fenton to Upham on the sidewalks?
Yeah, those decisions about where projects started or stopped usually were made on the basis of if there was a existing sidewalk at one end, then we'd be looking at closing the gap. Does that seem like the situation in that case?
No.
Yeah, well,
sidewalk network
yeah, I can add on 29th, we'll be realigning, reconstructing 29th next year from about Fenton to Ingalls. So that'll be included in the project, and I think the intent here was to extend it to J. And I don't recall on the map if there's longer term, if the plan is to try and keep going further west with it.
Okay, so past Teller up to Upham, because there aren't any
Eventually.
sidewalks on either side.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so it is being considered? Okay, because a lot of folks do walk that and ride their bike actually too.
Yeah.
It's dangerous.
Yeah, and I'm
At
going to
best.
mention too, Joe put this list of projects up there, about 20 of them, and they weren't ranked. These were like the high priority ones, but when we do actually start targeting projects to do, we're going to do a lot of looking at leveraging these with other projects, like if we happen to be doing, an overlay, or if there's a development going on or some other kind of construction that we can tag it with, we can do it cheaper and more efficiently. So that'll go along with the order with how we do these also.
Okay, great, because I know that that's been a question asked of me many times, if we're going to do anything along there. So thank you.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
I'm thinking specifically of Wadsworth. In the new reconstruction of Wadsworth, there's mostly going to be a separate bike path, I believe. And this is marked on here as, it has a dotted dots underneath the blue, so I'm not sure exactly what that means, but is that a bike path? What do the dots mean in that case?
Yeah, the blue dotted line category, it does include potentially side path as that's what we would call the facility that's being planned for Wadsworth, so a separated bike facility. Essentially, the blue dotted line is anything within the road right of way, like a dedicated bike facility within the road right of way. So it could be a bike lane, it could be a separated path per se.
Okay, that's a perfect setup for question number 2. On Wadsworth from 32nd to 26th, that's shown as a side path, and I'm not sure I really understand what a side path is. What do you mean by side path?
So a side path is, it's essentially a wider than a sidewalk. It's wide enough for people to bike on. So typically 10 feet, 8 to 10 feet, but it's within the road right of way. So as opposed to like a Clear Creek Trail, which is its own property, its own right of way, it's a path that's within the street right of way.
Yeah, it's basically like the Kipling multi-use trail, just right behind the curb.
So from this, I can assume that the west side of Wadsworth from 35th to 32nd, which is my concern, which is not included in the Wadsworth rebuild, will have a side path. Because from 32nd to 26th, the city border, there already is a sidewalk through the cemetery grounds.
I mean, I can tell you that in terms of the plan recommendation, that a side path would be within the category of facilities that would be recommended for that. It is obviously a higher volume, high-speed street, and we wouldn't say, here, just have a bike lane on this street. And it would need to be something that's separated and more comfortable.
Yeah, I would add that being that stretch 35th to 32nd is not planned for reconstruction anytime soon. A side path or a facility like that could be pursued, with CDOT, similar to the way we pursued, on Kipling there.
Where's that map?
I was hoping that we could, while we were rebuilding Wadsworth, we could include a side path from 35th to 32nd. It's not that far, and that would complete a bike path all the way from our 26th Avenue border to the freeway.
Yeah, the project limits for our Wadsworth project do end at 35th. It doesn't mean we couldn't construct sidewalk further south, but it would have to be really separate from that project. Otherwise, we got to go through all the same things, that we're doing on the rest of Wadsworth.
Yeah, I understand that's true, and I'm wondering from the city manager if we can include some money for that. Can we save some money from this year's budget and add some money from next year's budget to get that done?
Yeah, I don't know what the budget is. There would have to probably be some right-of-way acquisition, and if it could even happen on the west side. I'm not sure if it'd be east or west side. I think you had mentioned potentially the west side might be better, but I don't know if we looked at right-of-way acquisition. What's in
Right, yeah, we haven't really looked at it that close yet, but yeah, I mean, we could certainly do that, do kind of a preliminary scope, concept, preliminary design, and put some numbers together anyway.
I take it he's trying to get a bike path to 32nd?
Yeah, it is definitely, it's definitely a huge gap, and we understand that, and it came up during the retreat, and
Right.
if council would like us to spend some time and effort to come up with a design or a preliminary design, we can do that.
Well, could I ask for a consensus that you do that now, and we'll, just within the larger discussion here, could I ask for a consensus from council that staff be directed to investigate the possibilities? I was
think he said just
thinking,
the west.
I was thinking more on the west side because there is a sidewalk there already part of the way. And I think it's more feasible to do it on the west side. But if you want to do it on east and west, I'm with you. Yeah.
And I'm presuming something similar to Kipling, like 10 feet wide for biking and walking.
Yeah, I'm not envisioning a giant expenditure. I'm just wanting to complete a walking.
We have another
path and
question
bike
on it. Ms. Davis, did you want to ask a question about this before we do a consensus? Mr. Urban?
I guess my concern is relative to the current process that the Wadsworth corridor is undergoing and the legal ramifications of considering a separate project of any kind, regardless of its merits, and how that impacts that existing project and process. Because I think that that's more important that we finish this project than to somehow mess that project up by introducing a separate side project so close to it, regardless of its merits. And I would agree that it would be nice to have that connectivity, but it's a matter of how does that impact legally the EA and the PEL and all that.
Yeah, Mr. Brink was correct. It'd have to be a separate, distinct project, and we would work with our consultants on the Wadsworth project to make sure there isn't any issues of doing two projects simultaneously. Because if you do connect to the sidewalk that's part of the Wadsworth project, does that cause a problem? So we'd have to look. That'd be part of our investigation too.
Sure. I was just hoping to save money by having them do work on the separate project at the same time they're doing work.
Don't know if it would save us any money, but yeah, it would solve the gap. But
Money on making the rest of the
yeah, yep, yeah, we can gather information.
We got consensus there? Okay, we do. Ms. Davis now, back to the,
So, thank you for this report. It's interesting, and I like the priorities, but what is even more interesting, because you kind of never know till you know, is Table 5, which talks about the cost estimates. So I guess I just want to say this out loud, so folks, if they're not looking at the table in front of them. So just curious, that sidewalks and side paths is about $1 million per mile on a typical cost. And then bike lanes is about 25,000 per mile, and a shared street 10,000 per mile. So it's just interesting because it's a cost that you don't ever really see. And so when we start talking about, wow, we need sidewalks from Kipling to Youngsfield, and you think about, oh, what does that mean? And these numbers, it's nice to see like these real numbers because you don't really know.
Yeah, and I should mention too, I think, Joe, those are like average unit costs. And as you do projects, that these can vary depending on whether you need right-of-way or not, or whether you got to remove trees or rebuild driveways or that. So these are basically average costs.
Right, well, because they did say like sidewalks, 450,000 per mile versus 1.25 million per mile. So yeah, so that's is a kind of a average, but still it's interesting to know, and as we prioritize it, all of a sudden when we put this little chunk of money away, it doesn't go very far.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So with respect to a side path, I had a similar question with Councilor Fitzgerald with respect to what is a side path, and is a side path defined in the MUTCD? And it seems to be a new concept or a sort of a combining of other concepts. So I just want to make sure we have a clear path forward as it relates to using that type of facility. But is that something that's defined in the MUTCD or the Green Book, or how is that specifically defined?
It's definitely defined in the AASHTO Bike Guide, which is really kind of the governing document for linear bike facilities. So it's defined there. As I said earlier, it's essentially a trail within the street right of way, if that makes sense. But I think the Kipling example was really a perfect example. It's a 10-foot. It's more than a sidewalk because it's wider, but essentially it is a wide sidewalk.
Well, and I guess in the map that showed the difference between a side path and a bike lane, the Wadsworth corridor was indicating by the blue stripe or dotted line that there would be a bike lane on Wadsworth, but you're indicating that that would be a separated bike facility away from traffic.
Right, so what we did with the proposed future facilities is we didn't want to get too specific about whether something would be a side path versus a bike lane, because really that requires going to the next level of engineering study, potentially looking at traffic volumes, looking at right-of-way impacts, things along those lines. So that dotted blue line for future facilities actually encompasses both side paths and on-street bike lanes.
Right. Well, I guess in that respect, I would not be in favor of even considering on-street bike lanes on Wadsworth. I just don't, state highway and everything else wouldn't be appropriate. So I don't want to leave that room sort of out there. I think we should close the door on that. And I haven't considered the impact of a separated bike facility and what that would look like, but I just think even considering on-street bike lanes on Wadsworth is a non-starter.
I don't believe it is.
It's listed in the map as such. That's what I want to make sure we
I see what
adjust,
you're saying.
that it's defined separated from that.
Well, yeah, but how is it already indicated in the preferred alternative? Because I think it is inside of the right of way and it's separated, but it's.
Yeah, it's designed as a separated bike facility right now, but I see what Zach's saying.
I think it's in keeping with the dashed line.
But the dashed line also allows the possibility of a
on-street.
Right.
On-street.
Yes, my point would be, I assume that the CDOT plans and the actual engineering, the CDOT plans actually would have precedence over this. It's not like this document guides that.
I just want to make sure we're clear.
Yeah, that's correct. This is a real high level, almost 30,000 foot view. I mean, the plan shows that a bicycle facility is needed there, but until you go through what we're going through with the rest of Wadsworth, the detailed analysis, and then we determine there's a two-way cycle track on one side and a sidewalk on the other. I mean, you go through that exercise and you get down to that level, but for planning purposes, what this means is we need a bike facility.
Well, I guess to Zach's point, though, couldn't that be changed on this map? Because we know it's going to be a protected cycle track. Can it be shaded differently, or?
To the side path designation.
Pretty much know what it is, right? I mean, already the preferred design is a cycle. It's not bike lane, so what would we shade it? Would it be more of the side path if it's a protected cycle track?
That's right, yeah.
So maybe we can change that segment to that pink or that, what color that is?
My next question is relative to the priorities that were determined, and I know that it was more elucidated in the ADA transition plan relative to the intersection prioritization tool, but was that same tool utilized in this process, or was it a separate prioritization tool used for the bike and pedestrian master plan as compared to the ADA transition plan?
They were separate tools, prioritization tools. We more or less use the same prioritization as the previous bike and pedestrian master plan and the criteria that they used from that.
And as it relates to those priorities, how did those priorities intersect with the crash locations? And what kind of weight does the crash locations have on that prioritization?
Mm-hmm. The crash locations are not specifically accounted for in the prioritization. When we looked at the crash numbers, there didn't seem to be a lot of real hotspots, I suppose. I mean, the numbers overall, fortunately, are pretty low. So to prioritize a location where you had 2 versus 1, for example, didn't necessarily seem to be justified.
So you don't see the prioritization list directly mitigating any of the frequencies of crashes because of the frequency being so low?
I think that our overall recommendations for the types of facilities that we recommend and the types of treatments at intersections definitely are with safety in mind and kind of as the paramount goal, really, for pedestrians and bicyclists. And I also think that the other criteria that we've used have identified locations where there are more people out walking and more people likely to walk. And so when you put those two together, I think that there definitely is a safety benefit, but it's not necessarily going after places that had 1 or 2 crashes last year. It's more where the likely crash is going to be over time.
Okay. And then as it relates to a bicycle and pedestrian master plan, why is it that we would include the language regarding a preference for a nonprofit being a better tool for community outreach? Why is that necessary language to be in this plan?
Well, I don't know that it's necessary. I mean, maybe I should reread it to be sure. But I mean, I think generally the idea with that section is that often cities find that those types of collaborations work well in terms of nonprofits just being set up and having a lot of volunteers to kind of go out and do the legwork associated with that type of outreach, versus a city staff which has a lot of other competing priorities and those other types of outreach efforts. They take a lot of time. So it's just that in a lot of places it has worked really well for those types of partnerships. Doesn't mean you can't do it as a city.
So with respect to those partnerships, would it be something where in the best scenario, those nonprofits are helping us bring money to the table in the form of grants and other types of resources, where it's by collaborating with those nonprofits, they're bringing some kind of other resource to the table, specifically funding or otherwise? That to me, I think, would be the most appropriate type of partnership, right?
I think it certainly could encompass that. Probably more commonly, it would be that they would contribute their time and maybe funding to support their program expenses and things along those lines.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, does anyone else have any comments or questions? Mr. Pond.
And to comment, just thank you for the hard work on this. I know this is quite comprehensive and a lot of thought has gone into this. I just, perhaps, Mr. Brink, you can just let us know a little bit about the next steps and actions that are indicated on our agenda packet so that everyone who's watching at home can hear a little bit, and we can maybe direct some of this if and I think there was a public comment about the active transportation advisory team perhaps taking a look at this and you have it on your website, but if you could just talk about how we or the citizens can help in this final stage.
Yeah, this is what we're calling a final draft. It's not the final document. We are taking comments, public comments. We did send the plan out to everybody that was involved with our technical advisory committee. That was participants from neighboring cities. It was the AT-ATs. It was Bike Jeffco. We had a representative from the school district, senior community. The comments are trickling back in. We'd like over the next few weeks to get all those if we could from council and anybody else who might be listening tonight. But yeah, we hope to get those all compiled within the next 2-3 weeks and turn those back over to Joe here and get the document finalized, and then we'll be bringing it back to council for a final blessing, if you want to call it that.
Mr. Fish and Director Brink, we have been thoroughly educated now.
Thank you very much.
Very, very nice job.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for coming. I think we can move on to item 3. There's a set of keys on the floor there.
Okay, ADA transition plan. I'd like to introduce Jess Hastings, sorry, and Jeff Sokol from our consultant, Alfred Benesh and Associates. We're going to give a little overview of the plan here. Also have in the audience here Steve Wynn, our engineering manager, and I just want to also give some credit to the city staff, some that aren't in the room here. Kelly Rawson, our engineering technician, who's been a big part of putting this together and staying up to speed on all the ADA regulations and changes and going to all the trainings and workshops and keeping us up to date. And also Russ Higgins, Chad Ensley, and our intern, Andrew, who did a lot of field work out there to get us to this point too. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jess and Jeff. Thanks.
Let's talk tonight. We're excited to show where the plan is at. If we can get this to work for us. It's that top floor there. So you're going to see a lot of similarities between our plan and the bike ped master plan. Also some differences. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with ADA requirements, but we're going to give you a kind of a brief overview on that, and we'll talk you through the plan and kind of some high-level stuff on the plan we wanted to highlight tonight. Introductions again, Scott already introduced himself, and Steve. I would like to thank Kelly and Russ and Chad as well. They've done a great job, as well as Andrew, in helping us throughout this entire process, and they've been a great resource for the city. I'm Jess Hastings. This is Jeff Sokol. We're with Alfred Benesh and Company. We're a transportation firm headquartered in Chicago with offices here in Denver. Okay, so ADA compliance, why is it important? Believe it or not, 20% of the population qualifies disabled, and that's permanently, not temporarily, so the numbers are much higher for people who will be at some point temporarily disabled. Speaking on the bike ped master plan, connectivity is a huge issue for livability of a city and really making it a destination place to live. On top of including everybody and really increasing life quality, this is federally mandated, so it's not exactly an option, it is federally mandated. Department of Justice, through the FHWA down to the state and local agencies, are required to comply with Title II specific to this project. So that's kind of the why we're doing it, but what's the overall goal of the plan? Really, we want to make sure accessibility is increased for everybody in the city as best we can while being fiscally responsible and technically feasible. We also want to make sure that our goal touches everything that is required per Title II so we can be compliant for future federal funds and we don't open ourselves for any issues there. So a quick background on the ADA. It was enacted way back in 1990. It expanded upon some original legislation back in 1973, but this was more specific to public entities for both their programs and policies. It had a few things that were initially required in that 1990 law. The main ones there I just want to point out is the self-evaluation and a schedule to mitigate barriers, and then also to have a formal complaint procedure, which you'll see here in a little bit, which we have developed with the help of the city staff. And then you also need to identify an ADA coordinator. That's a very important role when it comes to ADA compliance. So goals of the transition plan. The city actually is doing a great job for accessibility. It's just not formally documented. So one of the biggest things we went through was we wanted to talk to city staff and really get a handle on the current practices, policies, and programs, because they are doing a great job on trying to increase accessibility throughout the city. It's just getting a formal document so we can have a transition plan that's adopted. We wanted to establish a baseline. That's the existing conditions. The city did a really thorough job vetting their existing network. We wanted to make sure we knew what that network was so we can then identify target projects in areas where we need to improve accessibility. And then we wanted to come up with strategies and guidelines to improve accessibility throughout the city. So this is an overview. It's kind of an outline of what the plan is, and I'm not sure if everyone has had a chance to read it, but these are different topics we're going to kind of walk through here. I'll hand it off to Jeff here in a little bit to talk about some of these, but these are the main points that half of them are required, and all of these are best practices as recommended by FHWA and the Access Board of the U.S. So these are all what's in a typical transition plan, and these are all included in ours. So, and I'm not sure how familiar everyone is, but everyone's heard of ADA guidelines, which is commonly referred to as ADAG. PROAG is what was released in 2011. I will say it has not been formally adopted by the Department of Justice yet, so therefore PROAG is not enforceable by law, but it has been recognized as a best practice. CDOT, for instance, has recently adopted the curb ramp portion of PROAG, and that's what we're recommending with the city staff, is to adopt the PROAG design standards for that. It really doesn't go above and beyond what the ADAG was, but it provides further guidance for public entities working within the public right-of-way, because the old ADA guidelines really fell short on that, and it left a lot of gray area for interpretation. We also went through and we looked at what the city's doing for their current alternative effective communication. Once again, doing a great job. It just wasn't really a formal process of the day-to-day activities and a lot of the public memos and notifications. So that's something we strive to try and get on everything going forward. I mentioned the ADA coordinator role before. This is they're really tasked for making sure that once you get a transition plan in place, that it actually is implemented. So often that's where a lot of agencies fall short, is you'll get a nice plan in place and then it doesn't actually get implemented, or it just collects dust on the shelf. Assigning an ADA coordinator really prevents that. It's somebody who pushes to make sure it follows through, but it's also a valuable resource for the city staff to use internally. Oftentimes there's very strenuous situations where maybe you can't meet the letter of the law, but you have to meet it to the extent feasible. They help to have a formal process to figure out when that can happen and document when it does happen. They're also responsible for updating the plan as it goes. One thing I should have said at the beginning is this ADA transition plan is really specific to the engineering department, and that's pretty typical across the country, is each department kind of knows their facilities best. The Parks Department and the Facilities Department have already gone through this effort, and so the engineering department is going through theirs. They've elected to use the ADA coordinator by department role, which once again is pretty typical, so that way if somebody within the department has a question, has an issue, they know exactly who to go to, who's a technical expert related to what they work on. Public outreach is very important and is required in the plan by the DOJ. It doesn't say specifically how, but we really wanted to get out ahead of this and get as much input as we can and make as many channels available as we could. I will say that this project is not as exciting as a bike master plan, so we did not get the turnout, but we did actually piggyback with their open house back in October, so we were able to educate some people, if not get a bunch of input, educate them at least on why we're doing it and kind of understand their synergy. But we did do the typical website, social media, open house, everything we really could. We had an online survey as well as a hard copy survey. We had about a dozen responses, so once again, not quite as popular, but still valuable input nonetheless. And then I'm going to let Jeff take over and talk about some of the self-evaluation components on what went into that.
Thank you very much. So kind of looking at the public outreach of that, and when you think about evaluating yourself, there's two ways to look at it. Programmatic way or the physical way. So the programmatic is more like what you would call a soft evaluation or a non-technical evaluation. It's really looking at, how comfortable is the city staff at the understanding of ADA, how effective has the city been to date in terms of accommodating that, how comfortable are they in reacting to requests from users or staff, existing staff, on addressing a disability or a barrier. It's also listening to what the public is telling you about how well are we doing. The other side of that is how well do they understand reasonable accommodation and the true application of the ADA. So reasonable accommodation is not necessarily going from point A to point B to create accessibility, but it may be going from A to C to B, and that you're providing a reasonably direct accessible path, but it may not be an exact direct, I guess not reasonably direct, but you're providing a reasonable path that may not be direct. You see that in a lot of cities. Give you an example of that to help illustrate is we have one client that we're working with that just blatantly made a decision that they were going to ignore some of the provisions of the ADA with some of their roadway rehabilitation projects. Department of Justice showed up. They're under federal mandate now. They had a 9-year window to make up for 25 years of ignorance, for lack of a better way to put it, and to become compliant in that. Have another client that we work with quite a bit that use an example of, well, if we can identify an accessible path that is less than 1 mile long to go from point A to point B, even if it went up 4 blocks, over 5, down 3, and back 2, that is acceptable as far as something that's going to prompt immediate action. Not exactly a long-term solution, but it is something there. So that's their definition of what is reasonably accommodating that. When you get into a building or something else, it's the difference between having an elevator versus staircase, or going around the building and entering from another side as opposed to being able to enter in the front. So kind of take care of that. So that's kind of the soft side of everything, or the non-technical side. The other side is what most people think about, which is the engineering, the technical side of looking at, let's do some measuring, let's check slopes, let's figure out, do we have color contrast for the dome panels that you see that help identify where a curb ramp may be located? Are the pedestrian push buttons 42 inches off the ground? Are they within 10 inches of a parallel sidewalk? Is the ground around it flat? Where are the pedestrian push buttons relative to each other when you have an intersection where pedestrian traffic can go straight or turn right? That type of thing. So part of the self-evaluation, and the city staff did an excellent job of capturing all this data. For what we've looked at so far is curb ramps and pedestrian push buttons, and the effort to look at the sidewalk is underway right now. So what do we find? So there's roughly 1,800, just a little bit over 1,800 curb ramps within the footprint of Wheat Ridge. Just about 125 of those, give or take a few, are actually under the Colorado DOT's jurisdiction, so leaving about 1,700 or so that are within the city's jurisdiction. And the percentages you see up there of what we found are just for the 1,700 that you're responsible for. Very small percentage are fully compliant. I would say the findings that we had are not atypical for what we find with any agency that we go in and look at. Unfortunate as it is, but you got to keep in mind also the ADA standards have been evolving since 1990. So requirements that were in place in 2000 were not good in 2001, and what was good in 2001 wasn't acceptable in 2004. There's little nuances there, but it does weigh into what we did. And we evaluated everything, as Jess said, kind of using the PROAG standards, taking into account what the current federal law does require for that. In terms of the pedestrian signals and the push button findings, there's 150 locations within the city that have push buttons now. A majority of them are not at the exact height of 42 inches. And 10% of them, so 15 locations, are completely compliant. The rest of them have some issue, be it slope of the sidewalk where the button is at, arm reach for the individual. Sometimes the technician or the contractor that installed the button didn't think about where the curb ramp would be, and the curb ramp came in later. And so the button was located probably on a flat piece of ground, and then you took the flat panel out and you put a ramp in. You know, it happens, but there are locations like that. As I said earlier, the sidewalk is currently underway, and those are some of the elements that the city staff is looking at to evaluate what you have out there today. Again, very common, very much explained in the ADA and the PROAG standards for sidewalks. When it comes to implementing things, and then this is kind of what's outlined in the transition plan, the draft version of it anyway, is figuring out what the priority is that you want to start tackling the issues that you find, because it's not the cheapest construction in the world. It's definitely cheaper than bike lanes and side paths and all that, but it's still it's a very isolated issue that has a tendency to radiate out as you think about if a curb ramp is 2 inches too high at the top of the ramp relative to the roadway, so now you drop that down 2 inches, so then the whole sidewalk's got to drop down 2 inches, and then there's requirements for how steep the sidewalk can be coming into the back of the ramp, and so then you start to domino your way out. The good thing is that they ever adopt the 2011 criteria, which is, you know, really now in a 2016 version that didn't get adopted last year either, is they are starting to put some limits when you're retrofitting those things in, because it is very impractical, especially in an area like here where you have a lot of grade change. We work in some cities, Omaha, Nebraska, for example, where very flat. I mean, you know, outside of a few older areas of town, it's pretty easy to catch up within 15 feet, but they are putting some limits in there. So when we looked at priorities, we started first with, you know, take the lowest hanging fruit, which is where you have existing projects ongoing already. You can use economies of scale, and making these improvements to put in curb ramps or to move a pedestrian push button, you know, a couple inches down is a lot cheaper, because you already have contractor or your resources there doing the work. So it's not mobilizing in to do something different. And piggyback on those opportunities. The second priority that's in the plan is to look at the location to target pedestrian destinations and kind of radiate out there. So high locations would be ones that are within a few blocks of a hospital, a school, a park, a city facility, a church, living communities, senior centers, those kind of things that really have a tendency to attract a variety of individuals coming, or a spectrum, so that you have the best chance to address those. Going into a medium, as you're kind of radiating out a little bit, you know, maybe looking at that 1 mile mark, looking at multifamily residences, looking at commercial zones, looking at neighborhood parks, that type of thing. And then, you know, the low priority is really everything else. You know, you're kind of thinking about as trying to hit the highest percentages first and then back off from there. The third priority is taking things that have significant barriers to accessibility and starting to get those off. And then fourth is everything else. And really four is, and all of these are kind of a waterfall of what the city has for resources, both financially, manpower, contractor, other emergency factors that come into that, and taking that. One thing to note in how we've suggested you have your prioritization is the complaint that comes in from somebody that says, 32nd and Wadsworth. I get that straight, right? I'm not local. 32nd and Wadsworth, there is not a curb ramp there, and I'm wheelchair bound. I would like to have a curb ramp there. Well, that is a separate priority from an implementation priority, and that is something that we've outlined as, that's a trump card of something you should try to get programmed in as quick as reasonably possible to try to address that, because you have a specific defined need, and you can get it. You can make an immediate benefit when it's practical for you to get there. It doesn't mean you have to drop everything and get there, but it is something that should be separate of this implementation and done that. And that comes through the grievance process, and we'll talk just a little bit about that in a second. So one of the things that the city staff has done is prepared a heat map to kind of show you the high, medium, and low kind of zones will it be of what it looks like in the city. So the pink color is the hottest, the yellow is kind of the medium area, and then the green is the lower priority. So you can kind of see as you look at the city how everything kind of may look, and it's kind of hard to see from the distance you're at unless your eyes are a lot better than mine. But there is a lot of dots in there that kind of show locations where there are existing curb ramps and ones that may need to be addressed. So this is kind of still a work in progress, but kind of gives you an idea of what this might look like and really how things start to cluster. And you look at if you're doing a project in a red areas, it may be very easy to pluck off something that's in close proximity and really have a good bang for your buck on your implementation priority. I'll let Jess talk about the money.
I got to talk about the good stuff. So what we did is we took everything and we put different prices to it based on the level of difficulty to mitigate that. If it's a really simple fix, like there's no dome panel or it's just slightly too narrow, that's still non-compliant, but that's a little bit cheaper to fix. Whereas if it's something where it's a full height curb and we have to acquire right of way or chase the sidewalk a long way, that is a little bit higher cost. So that is reflected in our different priority levels. This kind of gives you a baseline of what we're looking at for total cost. As you can see, if you throw in the PED signals and the curb ramps, you're looking at a little over $4 million for everything that's existing that's been identified in the city. So what we did though is that's just a straight line comparison. We wanted to go and look at a couple different options, 3 different options actually, so that way we could kind of see what one fits the city's goals and needs best. So the first one's kind of a typical fixed schedule. We threw out some years out there with the idea that there's a certain annual budget we had already discussed as a project team. This kind of gives you an idea of what years we're looking at for that. So if you just straight line the total cost of the curb ramps and try and hit that annual budget, which was about $50,000, which is currently programmed for the city in the CIP, with the caveat, as you see there, there is $20,000, which is actually coming out of the pavement maintenance projects. That's the curb ramps that are required. So if you offset that, that gets you kind of around that 50,000 number, and that would take 50 years to address all the curb ramps. And then on top of that, it would take about 35 years to address the pedestrian signals that are in non-compliant locations right now. The second option is you look at a true fixed cost and you say this is exactly how much we're going to spend as a city per year, and you can kind of see it prorates it out to how much budget annually that is for each of the different asset types. So it would take about 20 years to address all your PED signals, and then it would take an additional 30 years, so still that same 50-year time frame if you're looking at around $80,000 a year. That's a pretty long time frame, but it is what the numbers show. We'll all still be around, won't we? So the implementation schedule, the third option, which we kind of liked, was more of a hybrid. This is where you're really trying to get the best bang for your buck and touch the most people as far as hit those high priority areas. If we did try and stay around that 80,000, this one's a little bit higher, 85,000, we could accomplish all the high priority areas in the first 15 years of the program, and then subsequently move down to the medium, and then the last ones would be that low priority, with the caveat that once again, everything is always case by case scenario. One of the things that's very hard to look at from a curb ramp standpoint is, even though you can look at it from a priority level, you still get your best bang for your buck when you have a good project size out there that's in a local location. You don't want to disturb traffic a lot of times because that's when a lot of phone calls add up, you get inefficiencies. So the city staff, when it goes to a project level, will have to take that project approach and look at which ones you cluster, but you'd like to start with these high priority areas and kind of work your way out. So let's talk about some strategies of potential funding coming up here. So one strategy we identified pretty early on, and this is, like I said, not atypical to the city, is we think really furthering down some training and education for the city staff and eventually the contractors would be really beneficial. The worst thing that everyone feels bad about is when you do something, you don't do it right the first time. No one likes that. So let's make sure we can avoid that. Kelly's taken a great deal of initiative with this one. She's getting a good training program put together. This is something that other cities have done. We've assisted with that really is beneficial. The comfort level with ADA, for whatever reason, just isn't there with a lot of people. They kind of get nervous. So just providing some really high-level training does go a long way. And then further modifying some of the city policies or construction requirements that we identified. Some of that's standard detail language, some of that's standard specification language. Some of that is your public notification language. Just really making sure that that's drilled down throughout the board is going to help with consistency. Projects, routine maintenance is the easiest one. That's already happening and is required. So when we're out there resurfacing the road, let's make sure we're doing our curb ramps and let's make sure we're doing them correctly. That's the #1 strategy that most places implement. Going that next step is really the targeted accessibility improvement projects. That can be curb ramp specific, that can be sidewalk specific, that can be pedestrian signal specific, a lot of different ways you can achieve that. One of the huge synergies I think we're going to have is with the bike ped master plan, filling in some of those gaps, building these new bikeways and shared paths. That's going to really improve accessibility. And when you're going there, why don't you just connect that corner and fix that curb ramp while you're at it? That's going to help a lot. And then as far as other projects, whether it's those, whether it's part of the huge Wadsworth one, it's amazing how much those CIP projects really do affect accessibility. You don't think of it that way, but they do improve your sidewalk network, especially when you're putting it on the forefront of your thoughts. It's a pretty small cost to the overall project a lot of times, but it can go a long way to achieving compliance. And then obviously anytime you have a reconstruction or major rehabilitation, we need to be looking at accessibility on all those projects. I'll let Jeff, he knows more about finding the money than I do. I'll let Jeff talk about that.
I don't know as much as some in the room, though. So it's a big number, especially for such a small piece of the overall city asset that you maintain. You know, as Jess outlined just in the slide before, you know, putting in your CIP and addressing it with maintenance and maybe maintenance staff is one way to do that, and put it in normally your O&M budget. There are some options out there for federal aid or federal grants, you know, safe routes to schools, safety projects, that type of things, TAP funds, transportation enhancement funds. You know, when you get to stuff that's on the border, is maybe you can look at partnering with one of your neighboring entities and saying, you know, the left half of the street is mine, the right is yours. Let's put a joint project out there, take advantage of economies of scale through interlocal agreements and do that. Have several clients that look at bonding options if that is something that appeals to you for this, or rolls it. More importantly, they tend to roll it in with larger bonding efforts. So they do a total CIP bonding effort, and then accessibility ADA ramps or just a piece of that effort. You can rebudget some of your existing budgets to do that. That's probably not something that's going to be overly popular, depending upon who wins and who loses, but it is out there. Another probably equally unpopular way to do it is to look at some taxing strategies. You know, when you have infill development or redevelopment, to tack that on to those development projects, and maybe you're looking at TIF financing or something like that. We have some clients, especially on the sidewalk side, that handle sidewalks by tax assessments over a period of 20 years. So the city or the county upfronts the money and then pays themselves back through tax levies in the property tax realm. Again, not the most popular thing to do, especially if you don't already have that mechanism in place, but it is a strategy, and takes a little while before the city is really in a rolling wheel of that, where the money coming in is paying for what you're doing in that year. And then the other way to do it would be assessing a fee or something like that you would do. Is like a one-time, if you have a new residential area or something going in, or a big massive development is saying, you know, for every lot we're going to assess a $100 fee per lot that's going to go into just improving accessibility, that's going to serve the tenants of that property. Again, just some creative ways to help you know, shift some of this, or help the city fund this up front, maybe pay themselves back later. Different ways to do that. Last thing I want to close with is, you know, we talked a little bit about complaints and everything, and as I said before, this is really a key piece of accessibility is understanding where you can target needs to get the most bang for your buck. As part of the transition plan and working with the city staff, we've developed an outline of a grievance process for anybody, internal to city staff or public, to identify a concern, I'll call it, not necessarily always an issue, but maybe they have a concern about whether or not something has a barrier to accessibility, and a way to do that it can be documented, it can be evaluated by the ADA coordinator or somebody that has the skills and the understanding of the ADA rules to identify that and provide a way to track that and both figure out a way to resolve it. And then ultimately what you want to have is documentation in your file that complaint has been received, addressed, and then ultimately dismissed as either it is not a barrier issue or there is a barrier and here's how it's been addressed. That part comes into play most is if somebody were to make a complaint to the Department of Justice and say, hey, the city has a barrier and they're not doing anything about it. That's when the Department of Justice tends to want to come in, and then they start going through what you're doing with more of a fine-tooth comb. This ADA transition plan is a great first step tool to intercept that and say, we are doing something, we just can't do it all at once. But they are going to look for things like this and say, hey, you knew about this, how come you haven't planned to address it? And this is a way to document that. Going forward, this plan, as we've kind of outlined, is in draft form, but it really is a goal of continuing and documenting the city's efforts of improving accessibility, providing a means to identify where those grievances are at. It contains provisions on when you update this and how you track those updates. Provides a lot of details not only to city staff but to others that are doing things within the city so that you start to get uniformity and know that what's being designed and constructed is in compliant. One thing that we didn't talk a whole lot about is there are circumstances, where accessibility may just not be physically possible, either because you're going to have to go 300 or 400 feet to chase it, the way the street is sloped, with the way the sidewalks and the surrounding ground is there, it's just not physically possible to do that. And we've identified a means to capture those, and they're called design exceptions, and they are allowed under ADA to have that and document that. So if somebody makes a complaint about a particular location, and you go in and you evaluate and just say, from a technical standpoint, it is not feasible to make that truly compliant, and then you just document that, and here's why. We did what we could, but it just couldn't be enough because it's not physically possible without reconstructing the road, reconfiguring the intersection, buying a house, moving a bunch of utilities. That's called undue burden, and that just means that some things are just physically not possible to do or economically constrained from doing, or outside the scope of a normal compliance or accessibility project. Document those, and then you have that going forward. I think we're ready to take questions, I guess. Ultimately, we're looking for questions you have about the plan or comment, as our next step is to go out to the public. And then also, if not today, but through Scott and Steve and their staff, your thoughts on the budgeting scenarios and how you would like those presented, because everything is in draft form now, and we would like to change that to best reflect your thoughts before we make that a public document for review and comment. So that.
You want to do that?
Please, any questions?
Or you want to? Yeah.
Thank you.
Floor is open for general questions, and then Mr. Goff will kind of let you know where the city is as far as financial planning. Ms. Hoppy.
You guys had said that you don't have all of the data on the sidewalks yet. When do you anticipate having that data?
So Scott could probably speak to that a little bit more clearly. Andrew's currently doing that right now. I think we're hoping to get it done this year, but that's a large network to get a handle on.
Yeah, it's pretty time intensive. We've been focusing primarily on the curb ramps first, but yeah, I think we're still at least a year away on that.
Any other questions?
With respect to the grievance process, it indicates that our grievance process is currently in place, and I'm curious whether we've had any complaints come through that process and what that has resulted in, or if there isn't any complaints, My concern is relative to the prioritization process, that those grievance process sourced issues would take precedent over other more high priority issues simply because it was a squeaky wheel. So I'm curious as to how do we keep these squeaky wheels from getting the funding versus those that truly need the highest priority or attention?
So you don't currently have a formal grievance process in place. That's part of this. I will say that you guys have fielded several complaints over the last couple of years that your staff's taken, and they've addressed those accordingly. So that's great. As far as not making the squeaky wheel get the oil, that's always the hard balancing act. Having that one ADA coordinator, that's why they're very important, because they'll be able to provide context for maybe when that project or when that specific task needs to be implemented. I will say, though, that typically those are addressed just because it does raise it to a higher priority level just because the proof is there, but it doesn't automatically move to the top of the list. And that's why having that one singular ADA coordinator to have it kind of filter through is really important.
And then with respect to the intersection prioritization tool, that's what was used in this process as compared to the bike pedestrian master plan, is that correct?
Yes and no. So that's a great tool. So ProAg, and that's why it's important that we're, as a city, going to recommend adopting the curb ramp portion of it. The way ProAg is currently written is every single pedestrian signal has to be an accessible signal, which means it has to have the chirpers, it has to have the vibrotactile and everything. What the NCHRP intersection prioritization tool you're referring to does is it allows you to use the MUTCD guidelines for kind of taking more of a common sense and analytical approach. So that is what will be used to implement those. Currently, that hasn't been used to prioritize those. That's just been location-based. So before that goes to a project level, it would be run through that tool through the engineering department.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Other questions or comments? Okay, Mr. Goff.
Yeah, I just think the mayor wanted me to address kind of where we are financially and budget-wise. We did plug in just a $50,000, as was mentioned, implementation budget for, I think, the next at least 10 years of the CIP budget. We plugged that number in before, obviously, this plan was done. So I think that's something we just need to evaluate during the budget process and have a discussion with you all on which one of those options that maybe you would like to go down. So.
As far as the financing options?
Yeah, and yeah, they gave three different options there, and plus there's additional other potential revenue sources that we could also look at and discuss with council during the budget process.
I'm going to start with Ms. Hobby.
So with that in mind, the budget process, and you guys said that you think that the buttons are the very top priority because the time of when those need to be compliant is coming sooner. Is that?
Not necessarily. The buttons are located just because of the nature of traffic signals. Those are usually located in the high priority areas, but the curb ramps in that location and eventually the sidewalks are equally as important.
So, sorry, go ahead.
ProAg is not necessarily enforceable yet, and that's where the buttons first come into play. So from a true DOJ standpoint, those wouldn't be as high, but as far as the effort of increasing accessibility, those are equally high. Yes.
Yeah, so the reason why I ask is because before, I feel like before we can have like actual budget conversations about it, we should know how much money we'll need for the sidewalks once the sidewalk data comes in, to be able to come up with a good, significant plan on how to attack it all together.
Let me ask a question.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't know if everybody understands it, I know I don't, is there's a matter of compliance over so many years. And projects that might be ongoing or forthcoming, natural capital improvement projects or new development could satisfy some of that compliance.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
Which is probably some of the thing we're counting on.
Well, yeah, I mean, definitely, and I mean, just along our, you saw the heat map along some of those corridors. I think we have major development going on, and of course, those projects are required to meet all these EDA requirements. So it is ticking off some of our projects, but as you've seen, the list is big. So
And is it so much that you have to spend a year, or so much, what are we required to do? And pardon the council.
That goes to my question, I guess.
Yeah, pardon the council. I just thought that some clarification would be valuable for us all.
So that's an interesting question, because you're not required to spend a certain amount. You are required to improve accessibility. There's not a set time frame per se that's being legislated. The original ADA, which was way back in 1990, had a 3-year time frame for everything. That is unrealistic and therefore is not being enforced. What we'll say from what we've experienced and what we've seen across the industry, time frame, we're a little bit maybe on the high side, but there's not a set magic number as far as dollars per year, projects per year, or even a time frame. What you will most likely get in trouble for is if you set forth a goal or commit to something and then you just do not follow through with that goal because you chose not to. Revenue can change and a lot of things can happen, but if you say we're going to spend, $50,000 a year and we just don't ever spend $50,000, then they would have an issue with that.
Okay. Mr. Urban.
And I guess that kind of goes to the specifically related to this meeting. I've heard of situations where the DOJ or another lawsuits, they'll look to study sessions like this to determine whether the council was intent on meeting these goals. Did we move forward the specific goals relative to a certain dollar amount? And if we don't adhere to that dollar amount, then we can be sued through this ADA to, for lack of a better word, being non-compliant on our own plan. So we need to set that dollar amount and adhere to that over time, or else we'd be at risk of a lawsuit for being non-compliant. Does that ring true? Or
It does. Another component to that is the way that you'll track and update the plan. This will be part of the ADA Carter's role, is not just a dollar base, but also on an overall curve ramping burn rate kind of standpoint. So if your goal is 15 years, but we are able to cherry pick some CIP projects or IGAs or whatever it may be, there's different ways to get to that goal. So that dollar may not come to a play, but it's really the end goal of we are establishing a 15-year goal for this and corresponding budget.
Yeah, I would keep in mind that you're setting a goal today over a period of 40, 50 years. Predicting what your revenues are going to come in and everything. I mean, there is allowance for a hiccup. The issue comes in just a blatant disregard for what you say your plan is. It is something, you are at the mercy of what your tax revenues come in at. So, if you set a goal and you do your best to adhere to it, it's going to come a lot better. And using the example I used earlier about the one agency that just completely chose to ignore it and the other one said 1 mile, the one got their wrist slapped pretty hard and the other one said, okay, the DOJ came in and looked at him and said, okay, you're fine. We're not going to put you under mandate, but you got to do something a little bit better than that. And so they proactively started to address and something a little bit more reasonable than that, and they've been able to stay out of trouble. So and the DOJ has come back and looked and seen and said, you are making progress in accordance with your transition plan, and you're fine. So I think it's that. To your question about waiting on the sidewalks, just for clarification, in the realm of undue burden, it falls into, how practical is it to be 100% compliant. So I do agree, I don't want to mislead you and say that you need to completely ignore sidewalks, but the practicality of rebuilding, a majority of your sidewalks in the city is a huge financial burden. And when you consider that in the totality of what you're responsible for, it most likely a lot of that is going to fall to undue burden. Now, to fix isolated areas that maybe have a small gap or heaved panels or something there is a whole different story than replacing blocks of sidewalk at a time. So you need to look at that, and I think as that data comes in, we'll be able to isolate that, very similar to how we did with the curb ramp data, and say, here's your high priority, not necessarily the cheapest, but easy to pick off things to address first that are going to make a big leap forward without being a tremendous cost. So that would be something to consider.
and to echo what the bike ped master plan found, there was a lot of synergy that most, even though we only had 12, all the comments we had were pretty much related to sidewalk connectivity and not as much curb ramps. So I do think the public is really wanting that sidewalk, so that's going to tackle a lot of that accessibility stuff with that.
Mr. Wren.
You mentioned about grants. Could we be proactive and apply for those? Because I know they take time. I'm not sure if it's 4 months, 6 months.
No, absolutely,
But
you can. The one thing I guess I'll caution, and Scott could probably speak to this a lot, is those are not guaranteed, and so you have to
Right.
kind of weigh bang for your buck on that, because you can spend a decent amount of effort pursuing them, and if you're just not selected, you're out that money. But you can definitely, Safe Routes to School is one that we've had a lot of success on in the past. You know, with the school routes you guys have, that's a lot of good grants out there for that one.
Okay, great.
And we're definitely looking at that with working with RTD and Arvada up on 52nd, which will serve the commuter rail station and plus the school that's up in that area. So that's one project grant that we're looking at.
Yeah, partnering activities are always a big plus. Increase our chances, yeah.
Ms. Wooden.
I just have a comment on the Safe Routes to School. We are working currently through the Activate 38 project, which is working for 38th Avenue between Kipling and Youngfield. And we recently talked to the 2 schools along there, Prospect Valley and Color Strand, as far as gathering data to start the Safe Routes to School. We've been successful in some of the Safe Routes to School, but it's very, very competitive. And of course, there's a limited amount of dollars. So you're always trying to fight that. How much time do we put in versus are we even in the running for any of this? And so, yes, I think some grant money should be pursued. However, we really have to balance city staff time versus other time put in by local organizations who are willing to help us gather data and write grants and things like that.
I agree. I just wanted
Yeah.
to keep our options open and different avenues open too.
I was interested to see CDBG grants in there. That's something that we are, yeah, should I? Yeah. Okay, all right. That makes sense. Anybody else? I don't think we have to specifically do anything at this time.
Not tonight, no. We just wanted to make sure that we're moving in the right direction if you had any major concerns. Yeah, we're still going to reach out to the public, get more input, and we'll bring back a final draft for your approval.
And that's when we determine how we're going to handle this.
Yeah, the budget part we don't necessarily have to handle as we adopt this plan, but that we can do separately through the budget process.
Oh, okay, that sounds good.
Just so we don't get you in trouble, if you have thoughts on the scenarios, you want to give that to us before we publish it for public comment, because they may get used to seeing something, and if that number changes because of the intent of the council and the mayor, then that would be better.
Yeah, we'll talk about that internally and
Okay.
discuss that.
Okay, that sounds important. All right, Jeff and Jesse, thank you very much. You obviously know your subject quite well, and we appreciate your help. Place I have here it is. You tried to take it, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah. That was our last major conversation for this evening. Moving along to elected officials' reports. Jen, you want to give us something about the Education Alliance, or?
No, we are working on solidifying a date for the Martinson open house, and that will be during the month of May. So we know that, and it's going to be an open house for any Wheat Ridge citizen that wants to come over and look at the it's not the Martinson, it's the Frank DeAngelis Center for Public Safety, yes.
Martins, they're still called
At Martinson, yes. So look for that in May when we get that date confirmed with them and open to the public. Anybody can come through and take a tour.
We also have a resource fair, don't we, at Everett, this Saturday?
Right, the Everett Resource Fair was supposed to be last Saturday, and it was rescheduled to this coming Saturday from 10 to 2.
Thank you. Mr. Pond, anything? Nope. Ms. Davis?
So we have another Renewal Wheat Ridge meeting tomorrow, and it's at 6 o'clock. And I think this is a kind of a good example of, although this was about a baseball field, if you build it, they will come. I think that we're starting to see a lot of progress around a lot of our urban renewal areas that people are wanting to improve and develop. And so a couple things that are going to be discussed tomorrow. One is actually the Circle K that's on the corner of, so the northwest corner of 38th and Wadsworth is looking to build an entire new station. Kipling, I'm sorry. An entire new station, which is nice. But the nice thing about it is they're trying to be proactive in this and do it in a way that'll be, that will collaborate with the Sprouts across the street. So I don't know if any of you are used to that interchange, but it's kind of messy and people get backed up and you can't turn left and et cetera, et cetera. So as Circle K is looking at their plans, they're actually having to spend more money to make sure that they are trying to do it in a smart way for themselves, the city, and folks around them, which will be helpful because it'll also give access to kind of the field that's on the north side of Circle K, because there's also been some talk about developments there that haven't been able to take place because of accessibility. So that's one. The other one, and I can say this because it's in my packet, so I didn't know if it wasn't in there or not, but there'll be discussions about Hacienda, Colorado, that is looking to develop in Applewood Shopping Center. So that's great. And then there are some conceptual plans and stuff for up by the light rail. So those are all be items discussed. One, to see if it meets the whole blight perspective and stuff. But I think this is a good example of some of the investment we've made in our community that people are turning around and
They
adding
meet
on to that.
here at.
Yes, in
and
this
they-
room, 6 o'clock.
Okay, thank you very much.
Come one, come all.
And the Circle K one is going to be ADA compliant, right, and help us with our.
Yeah, that's
All
what I'm
right.
thinking. So they all are now.
They all are.
They will improve, yeah, definitely
Yeah.
the sidewalks around there, and we're looking
Yeah.
at undergrounding the power lines also in
And
front,
just
so.
the safety of the accessibility. Like I'm there at 6 in the morning and it's backed up, that you can't turn left. So it'll just be nice that they're thinking about that ahead of time and just not thinking about themselves. So it's really great.
Mr. Fitz or Janice, I would like some report on the Wheat Ridge Business District. Janice gets it? Okay.
I have nothing except I'm wondering about the place that is trying to meet the blight qualifications.
Which place?
No, I'm just joking. You said they were trying to meet the blight
No,
qualifications.
part of the discussions when they propose these plans is not to make a decision, but is it within our renewal plan, does it meet the Urban Renewal Authority removing blight?
Mr. Urban?
Just like most people already know, but the Wheat Ridge High School STEM program was the international champions again this year in their hydrogen and fuel cell car class division. So that happened yesterday. So
Thank you. Ms. Hoppy?
The Wheat Ridge Business District met on April 5th, the first Thursday of every month. So we'll be meeting on Thursday here this week. We saw a few requests about some updating and some upgrading some signs. I don't think we got anything finalized on it though. And I had to leave early because I had to go and be the head booster mom at the high school for the POMs. So that's my update.
Ms. Duran, do you have anything for us?
I do. I'd like to remind and invite everyone to the community meeting this Thursday at 6:30 at the Wheat Ridge Rec Center. So Mayor, you'll be there, and our treasurer will be there, and council, and some other organizations to update the citizens as to what's going on in the community. So everybody, please attend.
Clerk? Ms. Shaver?
Nothing really clerky, but I will be out of the office Friday and Saturday at a community corrections conference in Colorado Springs.
Well, once again, Coffee with the Mayor is Saturday, 9 a.m. at Vanola's. It's our monthly meeting, always the first of the month. Mr. Goff, do you have anything for us?
I don't this evening. Thanks.
Then the meeting is adjourned.